On this channel, I've tested and reviewed a lot of different gaming controllers, everything from PC, PS4, Nintendo Switch, Switch 2, Xbox, and some controllers that I've used have been really good quality and some not so great. And recently a company called Gamrombo reached out to me and asked if I wanted to test one of their PS5/PC gaming controllers. And I took a look at the controller itself. I actually looked at some online reviews for it as well, and I was pretty interested, so I agreed. And recently I received this controller and I've been testing it over the past week or so. And in this video, I'm going to go over whether this is a good alternative to the official PS5 controller for either the actual console or a PC, or if this is something that really doesn't deliver on what's promised. So let's take a look. For those of you who've been following this channel, I've received many different third-party controllers, and one of the things I always talk about out of the gate is the actual packaging itself. And I'm going to say that of all the third-party controllers I've received or purchased on my own, this packaging itself is nothing to, write home about. It's basically a generic brown box. You get the controller itself, a manual that goes over how to connect it, as well as the charging cable and the controller itself. Nothing special here, and I'm going to just go out on a limb and assume that my packaging came this way purely because of the fact that I was getting sent this by Gamrombo to review. So I'm gonna wager, I could be wrong, but if you order this from Amazon, you probably get a nicer box or packaging than what I received. But regardless, just a small point that I wanted to highlight. Now, kind of the main feature that's advertised about this controller is that once you kind of get it going, is that it lights up and has different lighting settings. And I've used so many different devices with so many different features like this. I like these things personally. As you can tell, I got a home arcade with a ton of different LED and crazy lights going on. So I like these things. It kind of fits in with my setup. But I thought it looked good. I thought aesthetically this actually looked good on this controller. Now, getting into using this controller, I do want to highlight, I don't own a PS5. I did all my testing playing Fortnite on my cheap, weak gaming PC. And so I had to actually get a program to kind of work, to get this to work, as these controllers don't natively register as well with Windows like Xbox controllers do. So I used a program called DualSense X, essentially, which receives and accepts PS5 controllers. You can also do a couple mapping things. That's not what this video is about. But basically I got that set up with this and I was off to the races. So the first thing I want to highlight, and I talk about this on almost every single controller review that I do, and it comes down to the actual joysticks. So I'm always critical of third-party controllers, joysticks. Some of the early generation PDP controllers, for example, had horrible joysticks in terms of the way their dead zone sat. This controller, that is not the case. The joysticks themselves feel very smooth. I actually like the tactile rubber grip that they put on the joystick itself. But as far as aiming and movement goes, I felt like this controller worked really well. And I thought, in my opinion, that it felt pretty comparable to other third-party style PlayStation or even Xbox controllers that I used in terms of the quality of dead zone. So that's a good thing. The other thing that this controller also has is back paddle buttons, which for a lot of gamers nowadays, I think is becoming more and more of a standard. Even Nintendo has added them and integrated them officially into their Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller. So I think this kind of become more of a standard, but I was happy to see that this has them, and it was pretty simple to set up the back paddles and map them by just holding down the set button on the back and picking your button and then picking the paddle. I thought it worked very, very well. And the actual face buttons is kind of where things start to change a bit for this controller. So the D-pad, in my opinion, was acceptable. Again, D-pads oftentimes are kind of an auxiliary button mapping area for things like items and games and things like that. But the D-pad felt good. Where what I didn't like about this controller was the actual face buttons on the actual controller. And what I mean by that is your X, your triangle, circle, square. Those buttons, the problem with them isn't that they don't work or that they don't register. The problem with them actually has to do with the fact that they're almost too indented into the controller out of the gate. So in other words, they feel like you struggle a bit more to press them in. And this, on most games, like if you're like playing Fortnite, for example, this didn't really mean much to me. But if you were to play a fighting game, for example, or a game that really requires heavy use of these face buttons, you might be disappointed. You might find that these buttons don't feel so great and don't I don't want to say the word respond because that's wrong, because they do respond, but they don't have the same tactile sensation that the standard PlayStation 5 controller has, or the standard Xbox controllers have, or the Nintendo controllers, which is really where I thought this was lacking the most. Now, as far as the actual everything else, like even the trigger buttons I thought felt pretty good. The bumper buttons were okay. They were a little clicky, if that makes sense. They weren't terrible, but they weren't great. I think they could have done a bit more to make them feel a bit more tactile, if that makes sense. Like feel like they had a bit more give when you press them in a good way. But that was kind of a minor thing. It really was just the triangle, square, circle buttons that, in my opinion, just were not great. That was, in my opinion, probably the weakest part of this controller. But moving into kind of the whole use of the controller, this is a good alternative to a PlayStation 5 controller at a cheaper price. Now, these aren't rock bottom cheap like I've seen with some of the other third-party controllers I've tested. These retail for around $69.99 on Amazon. But as far as what they offer for the price point, and if you like the colorful light-up features of a controller like this, I think it's a relatively good controller. However, if you're buying this controller with the intention of playing it for fighting games, for example, I would say you'd be pretty disappointed purely off of the face buttons. But for shooters and everything else, or general games you might play on your PS5 or your PC, like a Spider-Man or like myself, Fortnite, you'll probably find that this controller does the job and does it pretty well. And it has a couple little extra perks like the back buttons, as well as the actual light up features on it that make it interesting in that way, make it feel a bit better for those types of games generally. So not a bad controller, but it's definitely lacking in terms of those face buttons. And honestly, if Gamrombo worked on, you know, just increasing the way those face buttons sit and have them elevated just a bit more, this would be a really, really good gaming controller.